From the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm Stewart Patrick, and this is The World Unpacked. The Biden administration faced its biggest hurdles yet in 2022. It also had some big successes, supporting Ukraine against Russian invaders, managing a sometimes precarious Western coalition to oppose Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, and passing major legislation to better compete against China in advanced semiconductor technology. At the same time, 2023 brings major challenges of its own. Iran is inching ever closer to acquiring nuclear weapons. The war in Ukraine has no end in sight, and an emboldened GOP-led House of Representatives promises to make Biden's life miserable. How will the administration fare in addressing these and other challenges? With me today is Nahal Toosi, who goes by Hallie. Hallie is the senior foreign policy correspondent at Politico, based here in Washington, D.C. I'll ask her about how the Biden administration handled 2022 and about the foreign policy agenda it confronts in the new year. Stick around long enough, and I'll ask Hallie to play professor and hand out a report card to Biden's team. Oh, and one more thing. I'm also excited to announce that The World Unpacked will go back to its regular podcast schedule with new episodes every other week. Happy New Year, folks. With that, let's dive in. Hallie, welcome to The World Unpacked.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, before we dig into the issues, I actually wanted to talk about you and your work. You're now based in Washington covering Biden's foreign policy, but you've had previous assignments in Kabul, in Myanmar, London, and other places around the world. How has covering the White House in Washington been different? Do you feel like you have more access, or are there things that frustrate you, in a sense, from reporting from D.C. itself?
Well, I've been at Politico for 9 years and covering this beat for about 8. And I think over time I've established myself as someone people can't ignore, but getting
Is that a
access,
good thing?
yeah, I mean, it's quite different though. It doesn't mean I have access. In many ways, I actually don't have much access, but I kind of see that as a challenge. In some ways, I try to approach Washington the way a foreign correspondent would approach America, just looking at it in all its strangeness and oddities and trying to explain it
it's
to the
weird
rest of the
cultural
world.
norms, right?
Yeah. And there's some very, very interesting things. And so I've learned a great deal. And I must say the Trump years in particular were exhausting and exhilarating and very, very educational. Let's put it that way.
Well, let's get into some of the issues then that the Biden administration has confronted over the last couple of years, and particularly the last year. So I want to address the biggest elephant in the room first. I mean, obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine totally dominated the world's agenda, and certainly Biden's international attention in 2022. And the war now appears to be entering kind of a new, perhaps grinding phase. The administration's been trying to balance defending Ukraine without being pulled into a direct conflict with Russia. Do you think it's been successful in striking that balance?
In many ways, absolutely. It, has managed to approach this very carefully, giving Ukraine many of the weapons that it seeks without putting American troops or NATO troops more broadly in the line of fire. Now, a lot of this, of course, depends on what Russia chooses to do, right? I mean, if Russia does choose to attack a NATO partner, that could in some way or fashion draw the United States in. But we also have to remember so much of this is very case specific, right? Like just because Russia launches a missile at a NATO country does not mean that it has to be all out war. So as this goes forward, I think one of the things I have to say that's kind of driven me crazy about this whole debate about Russia and Ukraine is just from the beginning, this idea that this was going to be a short, quick war. I never bought that. I mean, first of all, the war began in 2014. We seem to forget that.
Right. So it's not going to be a short war in either direction.
No. And now people are like, well, when are we going to have peace talks? When are we going to have negotiations? We need to push them to the table. And when you talk to Ukrainians and Russians, but also especially, Ukrainians, they have no desire whatsoever to give an inch to the Russians. And so I just see this as going on, for quite a long time, barring an incident in which Putin is somehow removed from power. And even if he is, I want to add, that doesn't mean the war ends, because there are people around Putin who are more extreme than he is.
Well, let's talk about incidents. On New Year's Eve, Ukraine carried out one of its boldest and most lethal attacks on Russian soldiers using American-made missiles. So as the war goes on, what are the tripwires that the Biden team has to watch out for to avoid being dragged further into the war? I mean, are there any red lines that need to be, do you think, communicated to either or both Kiev and Moscow about sort of what the United States is prepared to do, what it's not prepared to tolerate, and in this case, also what Ukraine can expect?
I mean, I think the main one is, the U.S. would like to avoid too many or that many like deep inside Russia attacks. Now, I think the sense is that the concern is that Russia will ultimately blame that on the United States because of the weapons and capabilities that we're providing Ukraine. For the Ukrainians, I think they're going to do what they need to do to win this.
Right.
And we also have to remember what Putin's red lines are. And I think right now he still sees an attack on NATO or the US/NATO as a red line that he's not willing to cross. If he gets to the point where he feels really, really like he has no choice, he might do that. But it's about communicating to both sides that the United States itself and NATO, when I say U.S., I guess, I mean interchangeably, really does want to stay out of it. But it's also kind of a hard argument to make as you keep providing weapons.
Yeah, you mentioned just, and you said not just Washington and the United States, but also the allies. I mean, keeping the Western coalition has been the key, really, to supporting Ukraine in a lot of ways, right? How would you rate Biden's alliance management over the last year? And do you foresee any cracks in the Western Bloc? I mean, some people have talked about, hey, the energy situation might cause, some of the Europeans to bolt or to sort of change it up. But do you have any thoughts about whether that still is a danger, or do you see a lot of sort of solidarity and unity amongst the Western allies?
I think it depends on the level of fighting and whether this ultimately ends up becoming like a frozen conflict that where neither side can make much movement either way, and that lingers for a long time. That could lead to more of like a frozen situation, or at least buy time for Europe to adjust on the energy front further, to adjust on the economic front further. I do think President Biden is going to have not just a challenge over time managing this coalition, but also a challenge even managing Republicans, some of whom are arguing for less funding to Ukraine. A small number, but they clearly have a lot of power, as we've recently seen in the House of Representatives.
Indeed. The House's top Republican, Kevin McCarthy, is warning that his incoming Republican majority will not write Ukraine a, quote, blank check. But this isn't one of those things that's going to be easy, but it's also a question of whether it just ultimately gets frozen and just lingers that way for a very long time. And the question of how much we can help rebuild Ukraine in that sense, how far Russia is willing to go, whether both sides are willing to kind of stay at this. I mean, look, you got to remember, like, the Korean War is still not technically over, right? It's decades later. Some of these things can last for decades, and we have to be prepared for that possibility. I just don't think a lot of people are.
Right, that's fascinating. I mean, as you kind of anticipated a question I was going to ask, which is this question of whether or not the Republicans, now that they're newly empowered, at least in the House, and Kevin McCarthy has said we're not going to give Ukraine a blank check. Of course, that spending bill that President Biden just signed was $1.7 trillion of spending bill, but it included $45 billion in military and economic aid. But again, I guess what you're pointing out is you got to watch that space as we move forward, and whether or not that case is going to be domestically sustainable. I want to shift now to China. Back in October, you interviewed current and former American diplomats for a great article in Politico on Beijing's global ambitions. And your main takeaway is that when it comes to diplomacy, China is winning. It has a larger diplomatic footprint than the United States now globally, which will surprise most people, not least in Latin America and Africa. and also has some very aggressive wolf warriors. It can also wield its state-owned enterprises to secure economic investment and infrastructure deals with countries in a way that the United States really can't with its private sector firms. Meanwhile, the U.S. spending on diplomacy, and this has been going on forever, is just kind of flatlined, right? And, statistics about, U.S. spending, up to 15 times as much on its military as it does and the Pentagon as it does on its sort of a global diplomatic and economic assistance footprint. In your view, what does the Biden administration need to do, or the United States need to do to compete with China diplomatically? I mean, are there assets that the United States isn't deploying? Are there approaches we're not taking? Are there stories we're not telling, or does it just come down to resources?
Oh, I mean, I think it's both about resources, but also strategy and exactly how you use those resources. I think one of the things that the Biden administration is doing, to their credit, I do think they recognize that our diplomatic infrastructure is old and in many ways just too slow and not nimble enough to meet today's challenges. The Secretary of State has a modernization plan that he's trying to implement at the State Department. They have put forward these I can't remember what they call it now, but it used to be called Build Back Better World. They're trying to marshal the resources of allies as well as the private sector to offer more infrastructure funding to other countries. They're taking all these steps, but I think the problem is these things, even when an administration commits to doing this, including, I should add, improving technology and our tech diplomacy, another thing that they're doing. The problem a lot of other countries have is they just don't know how long this administration or this administration's ideas are going to stick around. They don't know if Congress is going to fund the ideas. They just don't feel like they can trust the Biden administration or any administration when it says, look, we're launching this program and we're going to be there for you. And they're like, really? Because, the other guy, the guy before you, he launched a program and we were all in on that. And then you show up and you threw his program out and you wanted to launch your own program. And this happens over and over. There's just no consistency. When it comes with the Chinese, though, they're like, well, the Chinese are going to be there. And when they say they have a 20-year plan, they have a 20-year plan.
Right, exactly. Right. It's like with that famous line when Henry Kissinger asked the Chinese official, I'm not sure if it was Chow and Lai or Mao himself, but what do you think about the French Revolution? And he said it's too soon to tell. There's a little bit of a different time frame. But I want to get to this question of credibility and dig in a little bit more here. Because I think you raise a great point about much less 1-year budget cycles, 4-year, 2-year congressional cycles and 4-year administration cycles. In the Biden administration's national security strategy released in October, the president, made clear, China is the single greatest long-term challenge to the United States.
The president understands this is the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world, the United States and China. And he wants to make sure that that relationship is properly serving American national security interests.
And so he's, rhetorically, at least, and to some degree in practice, trying to bolster U.S. alliances, provide some alternative economic frameworks, or at least ideas of alternative economic frameworks, and generally assure, partners in the region, and trading partners and security partners, the U.S. is in for the long haul as a counterweight to China, But at the same time, this is hardly the first time the United States has tried to pivot to Asia. We've heard that a lot, right? And, we keep kind of getting distracted by other parts of the world, among other things. So what do you see as some of the signature initiatives that the Biden administration has launched with respect to China or that affect China? And how credible do you think these are to allies in the region or around the world?
So a couple of things. First of all, the administration really views rebuilding at home first critical to having a better foreign policy and competing with China. So the Inflation Reduction Act, I believe it's called, that does a lot of infrastructure investment at home. They see this as part of our foreign policy, right? And so that is something that they will argue is an investment long-term in our foreign policy. The investment in technology, the investment in semiconductors, these things they say over time are definitely going to put us in a better position to compete with China. But you mentioned economic frameworks, right? Yeah, the administration goes around talking about, we have an economic framework for Latin America and an economic framework for
the Indo-Pacific, right?
Yeah, and other countries are like, we don't want your economic frameworks. I mean, they don't say that. They take the economic framework. It's not like they're going to not take the economic framework.
We'd like some tariff reductions.
Yeah, they would like trade deals.
Right.
They want, or better trade deals. They want access to U.S. markets. And that is something that's politically off the table right now, whether you're a Republican president or a Democratic president, because it's just become so politically toxic to talk about having international trade deals. And that is like taking a major, tool out of our toolkit when it comes to foreign policy. We're operating at a disadvantage when we can't offer those things, trade deals to other countries, and China can.
Okay, let's move on to Iran before our break. The murder of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini at the hands of the morality police for not wearing hijab properly has obviously led to big upheavals against the regime, and the unrest shows very little signs of abating despite Iran's brutal crackdown and executions.
Women defiantly taking off their head coverings, breaking Islamic law. Some going further, burning their hijabs in protest, even cutting their hair. These anti-government protests...
Is there anything that the United States can actually do, you think, to influence the domestic political developments in Iran? I'm also conscious of the potential dangers of, in a sense, getting protesters' hopes up. I mean, the United States has had, history, whether it's arguably in Hungary in 1956 or the Prague Spring in 1968, or maybe even a decade ago when similar protests were erupting in Iran about, you want to encourage them, obviously, but you don't want to also set them up. How do you see what the United States can do in this case, or along with its allies?
It's really interesting because it kind of often depends on who you talk to, especially among Iranians. And the Iranian diaspora, it's not exactly united either. So you don't always get some uniform answer that everybody agrees on. Some will say it's time to add more sanctions, and the U.S. is doing that on some level. But then others will say, actually, now is the time to ease some sanctions. For instance, allowing some of these protesters to have more access to certain technologies so that they can actually organize a bit more. And the United States has moved that way as well and done some of that sanctions easing. Certainly rhetorically, the United States has repeatedly come out and spoken in favor of the protesters, spoken out against the executions. But is it at the point where the United States is going to, send troops or something? No. I mean, that's not in the United States won't even officially adopt the regime change policy.
Right.
I mean, they won't even go that far. And part of that is because they worry, even now, they still worry that if they say something like regime change or do too much to support the protesters, that the regime will use that against the protesters and say, look, you're actually not a real movement. You're being directed by foreign powers, which is something they do anyway.
Sure.
It's a very strange, Rubik's Cube. It's kind of hard to piece it all together and figure out exactly what will work. But I do think it's safe to say that it has to be a very nuanced approach. And that's what the U.S. is trying right now.
Right. Because you would also, there are some, obviously, nationalist antibodies that you also could raise up given, U.S. history with Iran as well. So you want to be supportive, but you want to do it in a constructive way. I want to keep with Iran here and just ask you sort of prospects for, resuscitating the Iran nuclear deal. They seem to be, dim, stick a fork in it, it's toast basically. Iran's currently enriching uranium at the highest level, and it's deepening its ties with Russia, including in the war in Ukraine, obviously, providing drones and other forms of technology. Is the Biden administration, to blame for the fact that this stalemate has lasted for more than a year now? And what options, in a sense, does the U.S. have right now to, in a sense, prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon? Good
questions. The administration will tell you that the nuclear deal is not even on their agenda right now. They're not even talking about it. If you want to believe that, fine. But I think the point that they're making is, effectively, it's not something that they see any movement on anytime soon. You can call it dead. Fine. The nuclear deal is dead. And there's more than one reason for that. One is simply because of what Iran is doing now, the protests. Any deal would have to get through Congress. And I can guarantee you, especially now with what's going on inside Iran, Congress is going to put up a fight like you've never seen. But also, members of Congress are also really upset about Iran's support for Russia in the Ukraine war. And that's another reason they don't want to have a deal, many of them, on a nuclear deal with Iran right now, because they just don't think this is a regime that is in any way trustworthy. So those are some reasons. But another reason also is that, look, the nuclear deal itself is what, at this point, nearly 8 years old? I mean, some of it's just not as strong as it was.
Right.
Some of its sunset provisions are going to be coming up soon. It simply does not have the kind of strength that it once did. The Iranians have much more knowledge now than they did back then about building a nuclear weapon. So you could argue just on those basics that this is not a good deal anymore.
When we come back, I'll ask Hallie about the foreign policy outlook for 2023. I'll also have Hallie give Biden final grades for 2022. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. We have a lot of fun putting on this show for y'all, but we can't do it without your help. To support the work we do here, please visit ceip.org/donate. Thanks. Okay, so let's do a lightning round. I say a topic, and you give me a letter grade for the Biden administration and a quick explanation of why. I've got 5 topics, so let's be brief. And incompletes are okay, too. We prefer a letter grade, but obviously some of these things are incomplete.
So, Stewart, this is dangerously varying on opinion, which I, as a journalist, am not allowed to have.
Okay.
So what I will tell you is I will say this is what I think most people would give as the letter grade.
Sure, got you. Got you. Okay, no, that's fine.
It's my analysis.
Okay, got you. Okay, first topic is China.
B-.
Got you. And what are the main reasons why you think people would give China B-?
I think one of the reasons is like our diplomacy really just hasn't kept up with theirs. And I'm not saying that because I wrote a big story about it. I'm saying that because, we can barely get their people to meet with us half the time because we have incidents like former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan and delaying progress on diplomatic issues. I mean, there's so many actors in the U.S. system that affect the relationship, and the Biden administration still hasn't quite figured out how to manage all of those in a cohesive way.
Got you. Second, Russia-Ukraine.
B+. I'm a tough grader.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
sorry.
Well, that's good.
The people that, that I talk to are tough grade.
Well, that's a tough grade in the Ivy League. I'm not sure where else it's a tough grade. But okay,
the Ivy League has grade inflation. What are you talking about?
No, I know.
Everybody gets A's in the Ivy League.
That's why a B+ is a tough grade. So, but
nobody gets a B+ in the Ivy League. But go ahead. No, I know what you're trying to say, but that's kind of funny.
Yeah. Okay. So
I'm also a former higher education reporter.
Got you. So Russia-Ukraine. Why? A little bit more context to that B+.
One of the things you can argue is that if the Biden administration and previous administrations, but if the Biden administration had been tougher on Putin much earlier, maybe he wouldn't have even taken this step. They put some sanctions packages on him when they came in, and they held a summit with him, but it was like they were just kind of trying to, deal with him and set him aside. It's like, okay, we're going to wrap you on the knuckles and we're pretty sure you won't do anything else, right? So please go away because we have to deal with China. Well, you know what? That didn't work. So maybe you should have put a much tougher sanctions package on early on. Maybe you should have sanctioned him far, far sooner, when you thought he was going to invade, than waiting until he did. These are some arguments folks will make. I'm not entirely certain how it would have all gone, but I got the sense, that even though Biden really has never trusted Putin ever, for 20 years, he's never liked the guy, that he just thought he could manage him. And I don't think Putin likes that.
Yeah, he may not be manageable. Third one, Iran.
Oh, B+, I think. Well, maybe that might be a little bit too much. I think probably, depending on who you talk to, probably somewhere between a C to a B-. It depends on who you talk to, especially in the Iranian diaspora. I mean, some of them would just give him Fs, but, And look, people have very different views on what needs to be done in Iran. very different views. I mean, you have the folks who are, Iranian exiles who have personally suffered a lot of trauma, who really, really want the regime to be gone, and they just want the U.S. to do so much more than it is doing, and so they feel like this administration has not done enough. And then you have others who worry about the Iranian people themselves and the effects that things like sanctions have on those people, and so it becomes this very complex issue. And I just think at the end of the day, no one is really happy with the situation, because most Iranians in particular, I would say, they're so sick of this regime. They're so done with it.
Fourth one, human rights and democracy.
Ooh. I mean,
now the red pen comes out, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks would give like a C+ at the most on this. Sure. I think there's a lot of frustration with Biden on everything from what's happened to Afghanistan since he decided to leave. Sure. Women and girls are basically losing every right they have. Can't really go to school, can go to high school, can go to university, can't have most jobs. That's just one example. And Biden himself, has said in the past that the U.S. doesn't have responsibility for that. Okay, fine. But our departure, has helped lead to this right now in Afghanistan. And you can't say that we have no responsibility, right? I mean, surely there's some responsibility.
Sure, after 20 years. Yeah.
That's just one example. Biden's approach to parts in the Middle East, including Israel and the Palestinians, they really seem to just frankly, not really want to deal with the Palestinian issue. They keep saying things, and Israel now has a very far-right government, but the Biden administration just uses rhetoric, and they think that that's enough. Sure. And it's not really translating into more rights for the Palestinians. That's one thing. His willingness to deal with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who is widely loathed in Washington for his role in the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The Biden administration, like any other U.S. administration, frankly, does do a lot on human rights. They talk a good game. They've imposed human rights sanctions. They have really taken a lot of steps, certainly more than the Trump administration did. But like in every administration, there's also interests that the United States has, and they've had to make some trade-offs. Yeah. So look, I think a lot of people are disappointed, but I think a lot of those people, if they were in the administration and having to make these decisions, they would also be making very similar decisions. These are not easy decisions. Foreign policy is hard, and human rights is particularly hard.
It's a really good point about the sort of inevitable tensions that policymakers face. Last one is climate.
Oh man, I think probably B+ or A-. I think a lot of folks would go for that. And I think it's partly because of, I believe this was the Inflation Reduction Act that included many climate-related provisions. The administration certainly has tried to be an international leader on climate. But I also think you're going to have, it's kind of like human rights. There's a lot of folks who will say that they can do so much more. They have to do so much more. This is a climate emergency. I will say, as a foreign policy reporter, I kind of came of age in the terrorism, but now increasingly I'm finding that my beat is just blending into other beats: climate, cyber, AI, tech, all these things, and I'm just having to learn this stuff. So you and me both. Yeah. So when I give a grade on climate, channeling others, it really, really is channeling others, because it's not my area of expertise. But I just have a feeling, Stewart, that we're all going to have to become experts in it really soon.
Well, the great thing about I noticed this when I was teaching is you just stay one day ahead of the students, so you're allowed to grade them if you do that too. Okay, so we've talked about key issues that will definitely persist deep into 2023 and beyond. Russia, Ukraine, China, climate, etc. So I want to talk about what might be the administration's blind side. Do you foresee any challenges that might be creeping up in the Biden administration in the year that they may not see coming, or that we haven't really discussed? Are there things kind of on your radar screen as things that maybe we should be keeping at least out of the corner of our eye a little glance on?
Yeah, I hesitate to say that they're not seeing it. I think it's more a question of them not putting enough focus on it. And that, to me, is just relations with the global South in general. Latin America in particular, I mean, this is our neighborhood, and they feel so ignored. And they feel really frustrated because it's like every time the administration deals with them, it's typically about migration. Right. And they're like, guys, there are things here besides that. And if you want to, take care of the migration issue, help our economies, have trade deals with that, things like that. I mean, somebody, I'm sure many people have written books about this. Africa is another one. I mean, I just, when I talk to folks, there's a sense that the U.S. has really lost Africa. President Biden held a summit recently with African leaders, and it was like he did not hold any bilateral meetings with any individual African leader, which made it seem like, we're just treating the continent as a block. And,
right, an undifferentiated whole of 54 countries. Right?
And I did my own little quick data analysis. I looked at Biden's phone calls to world leaders. And, I'll just give you one example. And this was, a couple months back. But one example was at that point, France, the leader of France, had gotten 10 bilateral calls with Biden. Okay. And that is, just to be clear, that doesn't include the multilateral calls he's gotten with Biden, right? The entire continent of Africa, including Egypt, had gotten 5.
That's remarkable.
That's like 54 countries.
That's incredible.
And look, I know there's a war in Europe, but this war is affecting countries in Africa. Yeah. And these countries in Africa and countries in Latin America and elsewhere in the global South have votes at the United Nations, at multilateral forums. And and they just, I think they really feel ignored. And I don't think the administration fully comprehends. And part of it is because they've so focused, understandably, on repairing relationships with European allies and some Asian allies, partners, Middle East, things like that. And they're just forgetting this vast number of countries.
Yeah. My instincts are very much along your lines. And I mean, in terms of the importance of really doubling down on attention paid to the developing world, or ramping it up, I should say, since there's not that much attention being paid.
I mean, the Chinese are paying attention.
Exactly. And with the debt crisis, with all the fallout from the war in Ukraine, and frankly, demographic shifts, not least with respect to Africa, it's incredibly important for the United States to be devoting more time to that, because crises as well as opportunities are obviously going to arise in those parts of the world. Most experts say that the outlook for the coming year looks grim. Do you share that view, or are you a little bit more optimistic as you sort of look out in the next 12 months?
Honestly, I see a stasis.
Okay.
I don't see any major breakthroughs on really any front, whether it's China and the U.S. or Russia, Ukraine. I just think we're going to see a lot more of the same. Look, again, there are black swan events possible, but I just foresee that there's going to be, not a lot of change in the major conflicts. I do kind of wonder about Central America, I should bring up, and some of the challenges there, especially with migration, and not just Central, but also South to a degree, when you have crises in places like, and the Caribbean. Sorry, our neighborhood. I should just keep bringing this up. Haiti. I mean, Haiti's in a total meltdown, and barely anybody in Washington is talking about it. It is so bad. We could have a massive, massive crisis on our hands. And we already sort of do, but, it could get a lot worse, and it could affect the mainland, the U.S. much more quickly than we expect. There's problems in Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba. We've seen some strange things happening. I think these are the things perhaps that we should keep an eye on. But I think in the long, on the bigger fronts, I don't see much change. So, yeah, I think it's grim. I don't know, but I'm not an optimist by nature, so.
Well, Hallie, that brings us to the end of our show. I know we've put a lot on the table and just scratched the surface. But one thing that's wonderful is that our listeners, if they read your articles in Politico, will get a chance to read your incisive and beautifully written articles about U.S. foreign policy, how the Biden administration is doing or not doing, and the challenges confronting the United States. So I want to commend everybody who's listening to the show to check out Politico and see Hallie's great work going forward. And we look forward to having you back on the show in the future to benefit from your wisdom and your perspective.
Thank you so much for your kind words, and I definitely hope my editors are listening.
And your mom. Well, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked, brought to you by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and please don't forget to rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranata and Clarissa Guerrero and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. Catch you next time.